On November 12, 1889, a man walked into the marshal's office in Leadville, Colorado, carrying something that would haunt every person who heard his words for the rest of their lives. His name was Matthias Cord, and he had come to confess, not to one crime, to 347. Marshal James Halloway had been reviewing supply requisitions when Cord appeared. It was a cold Tuesday morning, snow beginning to fall outside, the kind of early winter storm that could trap a man in the mountains for weeks. Halloway's deputy, Tom Brennan, had gone to investigate a claim dispute at one of the silver mines on the edge of town. The office was quiet, just the crackling of the wood stove and the scratch of Halloway's pen on paper. The door opened without a knock. Halloway looked up to see a man standing in the threshold, backlit by the gray morning light. He was tall, perhaps 60 years old, dressed in an expensive wool coat and carrying a leather satchel that looked heavy. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, and his eyes. Halloway would later tell his wife that those eyes were the worst part. Not angry, not remorseful, not frightened, just empty, like looking into abandoned mine shafts that went down into darkness forever. "Marshal Halloway," the man said, his voice flat and precise, like a clerk reading inventory. "My name is Matthias Cord. I need to make a full confession, and I need it recorded in official documents before I die." Halloway set down his pen slowly. He'd been marshal of Lake County for 12 years, had dealt with claim jumpers and murderers, had witnessed 4 hangings, and investigated dozens of deaths in the mines. He considered himself a man not easily unsettled. But something about this man, about the way he spoke those words with no more emotion than if he were ordering supplies, made Halloway's skin crawl. "Sir, you'd better sit down and tell me exactly what you're talking about." Cord moved to the chair across from Halloway's desk with an odd mechanical precision. He sat with perfect posture, placed the satchel carefully on his lap, and opened it to reveal a series of leather-bound ledgers, 5 of them, each thick with pages covered in meticulous handwriting. "I own the Cord Mining Company," he began. "Perhaps you've heard of it." Halloway nodded slowly. Everyone in Colorado had heard of the Cord Mining Company. It was one of the largest silver mining operations in the state, with shafts running throughout the Mosquito Range. Cord employed over 400 men and had made a fortune that rivaled the great mining barons of the West. "I've kept detailed records," Cord continued, opening the first ledger. "Every decision, every calculation, every death. I want them entered into the official record. I want witnesses to what I've done." "What exactly have you done, Mr. Cord?" Cord's expression didn't change. He simply opened the ledger to the first page and began to read. "March 14th, 1866. Patrick Donnelly, age 28, immigrant from Ireland. Hired at standard wages, $1.50 per day. Assigned to shaft number 3, level 2. Halloway frowned. "Mr. Cord, I don't understand what—" "Shaft 3, level 2, Cord continued, as if Halloway hadn't spoken, "had shown signs of instability for 6 weeks prior to this date. My engineer, Robert Hayes, recommended immediate closure and reinforcement. Estimated cost of proper shoring, $340. Estimated loss of production during closure, $1,000. Cord's finger moved down the page to a note written in red ink. "I calculated that the risk of collapse was approximately 15% over a 3-month period." The expected value of continuing operation, factoring in the probability of collapse and estimated compensation to any injured workers, exceeded the cost of closure by approximately $400. I ordered continued operation. A cold dread was beginning to settle in Holloway's stomach. "Mr. Cord, the shaft collapsed on March 14th at 2:17 p.m., Cord said, his voice never changing in pitch or tone. Patrick Donnelly was crushed beneath approximately 4 tons of rock. Death was not instantaneous. Based on the testimony of the 3 men who survived, he remained conscious for approximately 11 minutes. Cord turned the page. I paid Mary Donnelly $50 in compensation, which she accepted because she had no other means of support. The cost of properly burying Patrick was $12. I deducted this from the $50, giving her a net compensation of $38 for her husband's life. I calculated this was adequate, as she was young enough to remarry. Holloway felt sick. "You're confessing to negligent homicide?" "I'm confessing to murder," Cord corrected calmly. "Negligence implies accident, implies lack of awareness. I was fully aware. I calculated the probability of death, weighed it against my profit margin, and decided that the expected value of Patrick Donnelly's life was less than the cost of closing the shaft. That is not negligence. That is murder by calculation." He turned another page. April 3rd, 1866. Thomas Chen, age 19. Second-generation Chinese, hired at reduced wages of 75 cents per day due to racial classification. And Matthias Cord began to read through his ledger of the dead. For 4 hours Cord read. His voice never wavered, never showed emotion, never paused except to turn pages or sip from a glass of water that Holloway numbly provided. Each entry was the same: a name, an age, a date, a description of the conditions that led to death, and most damning of all, a detailed accounting of the calculation Cord had made, the cost-benefit analysis that had determined that this particular person's life was worth less than the expense of preventing their death. Thomas Chen had died when a tunnel filled with carbon monoxide, because Cord had calculated that installing proper ventilation would cost more than the expected value of the workers' lives, factoring in the reduced compensation he would owe to Chinese workers versus white workers. Samuel Oakes, age 41, had died of silicosis, miner's lung, after 16 years in Cord's mines. Cord's ledger noted that he had been aware of the dangers of rock dust since 1868, when a study had been published detailing the connection between dust exposure and lung disease. Proper ventilation and water spraying to reduce dust would have cost an estimated $5,000 per year. Cord had calculated that the reduction in productivity from sick workers was less than this cost, and therefore did nothing. Samuel Oakes died slowly, Cord read, his voice still flat and mechanical. His lungs gradually filled with scar tissue until he could no longer draw sufficient breath. The process took approximately 4 years from the onset of symptoms to death. During the final 6 months, he was unable to work and had no income. He died in debt, having sold all his possessions to pay for food and rent. He was buried in a pauper's grave. Cord turned the page. I calculated that each miner with advanced silicosis would cost me approximately $30 in lost productivity before death, multiplied by the estimated number of workers who would develop the disease over a 10-year period, approximately 80 men. This represented a total cost of $2,400, still less than the cost of prevention. The entries continued. Men crushed by rock falls in shafts that should have been closed. Men killed by premature explosions because Cord used cheaper, less stable dynamite. Men who died of typhoid because Cord's company housing had inadequate sanitation and the cost of proper sewage systems exceeded the expected value of the lives that would be saved. And it wasn't just the miners. June 22, 1874, Elizabeth Brennan, age 7, daughter of Michael Brennan, shaft foreman. Halloway looked up sharply. Tom Brennan, his deputy. Could this be related? Cord continued reading. The company housing provided to workers was constructed using the cheapest available materials to maximize profit margin. I was aware that the wood stoves provided were of inferior quality and prone to malfunction. The cost of replacing all stoves with safer models, $1,200. Expected reduction in fire-related deaths and injuries, estimated at 2 to 3 incidents per decade. Cord's finger traced down to the red notation. I calculated that the expected value of preventing these deaths, factoring in compensation costs and lost productivity, was less than the cost of stove replacement. I authorized continued use of the existing stoves. He paused, and for the first time something flickered in those empty eyes. Not quite emotion, but perhaps the memory of emotion, like a ghost of something that had once been human. Elizabeth Brennan died when her family's stove malfunctioned, releasing carbon monoxide into their home while they slept. Her parents and 2 brothers survived because Michael Brennan woke and managed to get them outside. Elizabeth, sleeping in the back room, did not wake. She was found in her bed, looking as though she were peacefully sleeping. Cord closed his eyes briefly. Michael Brennan resigned the following day. I paid him no compensation as the investigation ruled the death accidental. The cost to the company, $0. I hired a new foreman at slightly reduced wages, resulting in a net savings of $40 per year. Halloway's hands were shaking. Tom Brennan was Michael's son. Tom had been 12 when his sister died. He'd told Halloway once, years ago, that his family had moved to Leadville to escape the memories of losing Elizabeth in a mining camp up north. The Cord Mining Company camp. "Mr. Cord," Halloway said, his voice rough, "why are you telling me this?" Cord opened his eyes and looked at the marshal with that terrible, empty gaze. "Because I'm dying," he said simply. "The doctors give me perhaps 3 months. Cancer of the stomach. Inoperable." "And you want absolution? You think confessing will—" "I want no absolution," Cord interrupted. "I want documentation. I want it recorded that I knew exactly what I was doing, that every death was a conscious choice, a calculated decision that profit mattered more than human life." He gestured to the remaining ledgers. "There are 291 more entries. Would you like me to continue, or would you prefer to read them yourself?" Halloway stared at the ledgers, feeling the weight of what they represented. Nearly 350 deaths, each one methodically documented, each one the result of a deliberate calculation that human life had a dollar value, and that value was negotiable. "I'll read them," Holloway said quietly, "but you're staying right here while I do." "Of course," Cord said. "I have nowhere else to be." Marshal Holloway read for 2 days. He sent word to the town council that he was investigating a matter of utmost importance and was not to be disturbed. He had food brought in. He barely slept. The ledgers were meticulous and horrifying. Each death was documented with the same cold precision. The name, the circumstances, the calculation that had led to the decision to prioritize profit over safety, and the ultimate result. What made it worse was that none of it was technically illegal. Mine safety regulations in 1889 were virtually non-existent. There were no federal laws requiring proper ventilation or limiting working hours, no requirements for safety equipment or structural inspections. Companies were free to operate as they saw fit, and workers who didn't like the conditions could simply quit, assuming they could afford to lose their jobs. Matthias Cord had broken no laws. He had simply followed the logic of profit maximization to its ultimate, monstrous conclusion, treating human beings as resources to be expended when the cost of preserving them exceeded their economic value. And he had kept perfect records of every decision, every calculation, every death. On the 3rd day, Holloway looked up from the final ledger to find Cord sitting exactly where he'd been since the confession began, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. "Why?" Holloway asked. "Why keep these records? Why document your own crimes?" For the first time, Cord's expression changed slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to it, bitter and cold. "Because someone needed to," he said. "Because these men and women died, and no one counted them. No one remembered their names. They were just losses in a profit margin, unfortunate accidents, the cost of doing business." He leaned forward slightly. "I wanted to make sure someone knew. I wanted to make sure their deaths were recorded, even if only in my own ledgers, even if the only person who knew the truth was the man who killed them." "That's not justice," Holloway said. "No," Cord agreed. "It's accounting. But perhaps that's all we can hope for in this world, that someone keeps the books, even if the debts are never paid." Marshal Holloway spent the next week trying to determine if any charges could be brought against Matthias Cord. He consulted with the county prosecutor, with lawyers in Denver, with anyone who might know if there was a legal framework for punishing what Cord had done. The answer was always the same: no. Negligent homicide required proof that Cord had violated some duty of care. But in 1889, mining companies had virtually no legal duty of care to their workers. Murder required intent to kill a specific person, but Cord's calculations were about probabilities and expected values, not specific targets. What he had done was monstrous. It was also perfectly legal. "He's going to get away with it," Holloway told his deputy, Tom Brennan, finally revealing what he'd learned. Tom's face went white when Halloway told him about Elizabeth's entry in the ledgers. "He killed my sister," Tom said, his voice shaking. "He knew the stoves were dangerous. He knew, and he did nothing because it was cheaper to let children die." "I know," Halloway said quietly, "but there's no law against it, not one that would hold up in court." Tom was silent for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. "Then the law is broken," he said finally. "If it can't touch a man who murdered 347 people, then the law is worse than useless." Halloway had no answer for that. The story of Matthias Cord's confession spread through Leadville like wildfire. Within days, everyone knew. The families of the dead miners gathered outside Cord's mansion, demanding justice, demanding he face consequences for what he'd done. Cord never appeared. He remained inside, attended by a single servant, slowly dying of the cancer that was eating away at his stomach. The town council held an emergency meeting. Could they seize his assets? Force restitution to the families? Ban the Cord Mining Company from operating? The lawyers said no. Cord had broken no laws. His property was his own. And if they tried to seize it without legal grounds, his heirs would sue and win, bankrupting the town in the process. The system that had allowed Cord to profit from death now protected him from consequences. But Marshal Halloway wasn't finished. If he couldn't bring Cord to justice legally, he could at least do what Cord himself had requested: document everything and make sure the truth was preserved. He had Cord's ledgers copied in their entirety, page by page, entry by entry. He filed them with the county recorder's office as official documents, part of Cord's sworn confession. He had copies made and sent to newspapers in Denver and San Francisco, and he began his own investigation, interviewing the families of the dead, documenting their stories, adding context and humanity to Cord's cold calculations. Where Cord had written, "Patrick Donnelly, age 28, estimated economic value less than cost of shaft closure," Halloway wrote, "Patrick Donnelly came to America from County Cork in 1862, seeking a better life. He met Mary O'Sullivan at a church social in Denver. They married in September 1865. Mary was pregnant when Patrick died. Their daughter Catherine was born in November 1866. Mary never remarried. She worked as a seamstress and laundress to support herself and her child, never earning more than $4 a week. She died in 1881, age 36, of tuberculosis contracted from poor living conditions. Catherine was sent to an orphanage." For each name in Cord's ledger, Halloway added the human story behind it. The families destroyed, the children left orphaned, the widows forced into poverty, the futures stolen. It took him 6 months, but when he was finished, he had created a counter-ledger, one that matched Cord's calculations with human cost, that turned numbers into names and names into stories. He called it the true accounting of the Cord Mining Company. Matthias Cord died on February 7, 1890, 3 months after his confession, exactly as the doctors had predicted. He died alone in his mansion, the single servant having left the previous day, unwilling to stay with a man the entire town had condemned. He left no will. He had no family. His entire fortune, An estimated $2 million reverted to the state, which began the process of liquidating his assets. The Cord Mining Company was sold to a consortium of investors from Chicago. The new owners reviewed the operations, examined the books, and made some immediate changes. They installed proper ventilation systems. They replaced the dangerous equipment. They improved the company housing and hired a full-time doctor for the workers, not out of compassion, but out of calculation. The new owners had read the newspapers. They'd seen the public outrage over Cord's confession. They understood that the winds were changing, that there was increasing pressure for mining regulations and safety laws, and they calculated that the cost of preventing deaths was now less than the cost of the public relations disasters that would follow if they continued Cord's practices. The math had changed. Human life had become more expensive. But it was still just math. Marshall Halloway watched all of this with a bitter sense of incompleteness. Cord was dead, but his wealth had simply transferred to others. The company continued operating, slightly safer, but still prioritizing profit. The families of the dead received nothing. Justice, in any meaningful sense, had not been served. But Halloway continued his documentation. He tracked what happened to each family he'd interviewed, noting how their lives had been shaped by the deaths Cord had calculated. Michael Brennan, Tom's father, had never fully recovered from Elizabeth's death. He worked odd jobs around Leadville, drinking heavily, dying in 1892 at 51, when he fell from a roof he was repairing. Tom believed his father had wanted to fall, that he'd been looking for a way out since the day Elizabeth died. Mary Donnelly's daughter, Catherine, had grown up in the orphanage. At 16, she'd left to work as a domestic servant. At 18, she'd contracted typhoid from the unsanitary conditions in her employer's home and died the same age her mother had been when Patrick was killed. The pattern repeated across the families. The deaths in Cord's ledger created ripples that spread out through decades, destroying lives in ways that couldn't be easily quantified or calculated. Halloway documented all of it, adding to his counterledger, creating a record that stretched beyond Cord's immediate crimes to show their long-term consequences. In 1893, Colorado passed its first mining safety regulations. They were weak, mostly voluntary standards with minimal enforcement, but they were something, a recognition that companies had at least some responsibility for worker safety. The legislation cited the Cord case extensively. Matthias Cord's meticulous documentation of his own crimes had become evidence in the political fight for regulation. In death, his ledgers had accomplished what they couldn't in life. They'd forced people to see the human cost of unregulated capitalism, to recognize that treating people as expendable resources led to systematic murder. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Marshall Halloway retired in 1895 at age 60. He'd spent the last 6 years of his career documenting the Cord case and its aftermath, creating a comprehensive record that filled dozens of volumes. He donated them to the Colorado Historical Society, with a note explaining why he dedicated so much time to the project. Matthias Cord kept his ledgers to document his crimes, but he recorded them as calculations, as numbers and expected values. I wanted to make sure someone recorded them as people, as lives that mattered, as families destroyed, as futures stolen. He wanted his accounting preserved. I wanted to make sure the true cost was documented as well. Let anyone who reads these records understand this is what happens when human beings become numbers in a profit calculation. This is the monster that emerges when we decide that some lives have measurable value, and that value can be weighed against money. Cord was unusual only in his honesty. He documented what many others did and continued to do without recording it. He confessed to murders that the law didn't recognize as crimes. But the dead are still dead, the families still destroyed, the calculations still monstrous. I hope someday we build a society where such calculations are not just immoral, but impossible, where human life cannot be reduced to expected value and weighed against profit margins. Until then, let this record stand as testimony to what we allowed to happen and what we must never allow again. The Cord ledgers became famous in academic circles. Economists studied them as examples of rational profit maximization taken to its logical extreme. Sociologists analyzed them as evidence of the human cost of industrialization. Lawyers cited them in arguments for stronger labor protections and corporate liability. But for most people, they remained distant history, a disturbing story from the rough days of frontier mining, a cautionary tale about a monster who had kept meticulous records of his own monstrosity. The truth was more complicated. In 1924, a researcher named Eleanor Vance was studying the history of mining regulations in Colorado. She came across Halloway's counterledger and became fascinated by the case. She spent 3 years tracking down the families mentioned in both ledgers, interviewing descendants, piecing together what had happened to them over the decades since Cord's death. What she found was disturbing. The Cord Mining Company, under its new owners, had continued operating until 1919, when the silver deposits were finally exhausted. During those 30 years, another 47 workers had died in accidents. The rate was lower than under Cord's management, but the pattern was the same. Safety measures that cost money were implemented slowly or not at all. Deaths were treated as acceptable losses, and compensation to families was minimal. Cord's successors had simply been less honest about their calculations. Vance expanded her research, looking at other mining companies, other industries. She found the same pattern everywhere. Companies making calculated decisions about how much safety was worth, how many deaths were acceptable, how little compensation they could get away with paying. The calculations were usually not written down. The decision-makers were less meticulous than Cord, but the underlying logic was identical. Human life had a dollar value, and when the cost of preventing death exceeded that value, death was acceptable. Cord hadn't been a unique monster. He'd simply been more honest than most. Vance published her findings in 1927 under the title The Invisible Ledger: Industrial Death in American Capitalism. It caused a brief stir in academic circles, contributed to the push for stronger labor laws, and then was largely forgotten. The book remained out of print for decades. In 1978, a lawyer named David Reeves discovered a copy of Vance's book in a used bookstore in Boulder. He was working on a case involving a chemical plant where workers had been exposed to toxic substances the company knew were dangerous. The company's internal documents showed they had calculated the expected cost of lawsuits from sick workers and determined it was less than the cost of improving safety conditions. It was the Cord case all over again, just with different chemicals and a longer timeline. Reeves used Vance's research and the Cord ledgers as part of his argument, drawing parallels between Cord's meticulous calculations and the modern company's cost-benefit analysis of worker deaths. He won the case. The precedent he established became important in future litigation against companies that knowingly exposed workers to dangerous conditions. The Cord ledgers, nearly 90 years old, became relevant again. Today, Matthias Cord's original ledgers are held in the archives of the Colorado Historical Society. They're available to researchers by appointment, though few people request them. Marshall Halloway's counter-ledger sits beside them, equally accessible and equally ignored. Eleanor Vance's book was reprinted in 2003 with a new introduction, placing it in the context of modern corporate liability law. It sells modestly, mostly to law students and labor historians. The Cord Mining Company's old headquarters building in Leadville is now a museum dedicated to mining history. There's a small exhibit about Matthias Cord, describing him as a controversial figure whose detailed records provide insight into the harsh realities of 19th century mining operations. The exhibit doesn't use the word murder, but there's a memorial outside the museum, installed in 1991, listing the names from Cord's ledger. 347 names carved into black granite. At the bottom, there's an inscription. They were not acceptable losses. They were not expected values. They were people, and they mattered. In 2019, a journalist named Sarah Chen was researching a story about a tech company that had allegedly suppressed safety concerns about one of its products. Internal documents showed the company had calculated the expected cost of lawsuits versus the cost of a recall, and decided the lawsuits would be cheaper. Chen had heard of the Cord case vaguely. It had come up in a business ethics class she'd taken in college. She decided to look deeper. She spent a week in the Colorado Historical Society's archives, reading through both ledgers. What struck her most wasn't the monstrous calculations or even the horrifying death toll. It was the realization that the same logic was still being used every day by companies around the world. They didn't write it down as explicitly as Cord had. They used euphemisms like acceptable risk and cost-benefit analysis, but the underlying calculation was identical. How much is a human life worth, and when is it cheaper to let people die than to prevent their deaths? Chen's article, The Cord Calculation, How Matthias Cord's 1889 Murder Ledger Explains Modern Corporate Negligence, went viral. It sparked renewed interest in the case, led to academic conferences examining the ethics of risk analysis, and became part of the ongoing debate about corporate liability and the value of human life. Matthias Cord had wanted his accounting preserved. 130 years later, it was more relevant than ever. The question that haunts everyone who studies the Cord case is this: was Matthias Cord evil? He certainly committed evil acts. 347 people died because he calculated their lives were worth less than his profits. But he was also following a logic that was, and is, considered acceptable in business: rational profit maximization, cost-benefit analysis, expected value calculation. The same logic taught in business schools, used by corporations, defended by economists as efficient allocation of resources. Cord's crime wasn't that he used this logic. His crime was that he was honest about it. He documented the human cost of treating people as resources. He recorded the names of the dead instead of hiding them in aggregate statistics. He confessed to murder instead of calling it acceptable loss. And in doing so, he created a record that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system that allowed Cord to kill 347 people through calculated neglect is still operating. The calculations are more sophisticated now. The language is more carefully sanitized.
The distance between decision-makers and consequences is greater. But the fundamental logic remains. Human life has a dollar value, and when the cost of preserving life exceeds that value, death is acceptable. Cord's ledgers stand as testimony to where that logic leads when followed without constraint or conscience. They're a record of murder by mathematics, and they're a warning that we still haven't fully heeded. Marshall James Halloway's final entry in his Counter Ledger, written in 1895, shortly before he donated the volumes to the Historical Society, reads, "I have spent 6 years documenting the consequences of Matthias Cord's crimes. I have interviewed families, tracked descendants, calculated the ripple effects of each death through generations. The true cost of Cord's calculations cannot be measured. The lives destroyed, the potential stolen, the suffering inflicted. It extends beyond what any ledger can capture. But I have tried to document what I could, to put names and faces and stories to the numbers in Cord's books, to make sure someone remembers that these were people, not acceptable losses." Cord wanted his accounting preserved. I hope I have preserved the truth that his accounting could never capture. That human beings are not resources to be expended, not expected values to be calculated, not acceptable losses to be written off. We are people. We matter. Our lives have value that cannot be reduced to dollars and cents. I hope someday we build a world where that truth is self-evident, where no one needs to keep ledgers like these, because no one would consider making calculations like Cord's. Until then, let this record stand. Let it remind us of what we were and what we must never be again. The books
are balanced. The accounting is complete. The dead are still dead. And Matthias Cord's greatest crime was not murder, but the cold, calculated logic that made murder seem reasonable. May we never make that calculation again. The ledgers remain in the archives, waiting for the next person who needs to understand what happens when human life becomes a line item in a profit calculation. 347 names, each one a person, each one a murder, each one a warning. The books are open, the accounting is clear. We just need to be willing to read it.